Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you might be around the world. And thank you for joining today's webinar, Ask a Professional Scrum Trainer, featuring Rich Visotcky. Rich is one of our professional Scrum trainers based in the Midwest here in the US, and he's here to take your questions today. My name is Eric Naberg, and I'll be your host. I run marketing and operations for Ken Schwaber here at Scrum.org. Next slide, Rich. So this series, as many of you probably already know, and those of you who don't, welcome. We try to run these about once a month, where it gives you an opportunity to ask one of our professional Scrum trainers or more questions that maybe are coming up in your work, in the work that you're doing, and to help you continue to learn and continue to grow. We probably won't get to all the questions. I'll put that out there right now, as we generally never do, but we'll do our best to address those questions that we don't hit and answer via email following the event. Next slide, Rich. So just briefly, who is Scrum.org? Scrum is founded by, as I mentioned, Ken Schwaber, the co-creator of Scrum. Ken continues to lead our organization as our chairman. We provide both training and certification to help improve professionalism and how people use, work, and evolve with Scrum, as well as putting out a whole lot of free resources to help you with your continued learning, much like this webinar today. Next slide. And with that, Rich, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Thanks, Eric. So yeah, I'm Rich Visotcky. Pleasure to be here today to take your questions and try to help out as best as I can. I'm the president and founder of Joint Insights. We're a company that is mostly focused on helping people have more transparent conversations about their work and how they work. Scrum just happens to be a really great medium for doing that. I've been a PST for about 6.5 years now. Came in through the PSD class in the development track and was a software developer for a long time. Right now, I'm the one of the 2 stewards for the Professional Scrum Foundations course, an awesome course about learning Scrum on how to do it, and the other courses up there I teach as well. Also a License Management 3.0 facilitator to kind of help bridge that gap of like how do we create these good spaces for Scrum teams to really go and thrive. So I live up here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Just got a kid and a dog, and kind of love life, up here. Well, it's still warm enough to go outside.
Great, thanks, Rich. Next slide. So just real quick, and then I'll hand it back over to you, the audience, and to Rich. Start asking your questions. You'll see on the little portal here for GoToWebinar how to ask those questions. Just type them in, ask away. We'll try to respond to the best of our ability, and I'll go through them and get them over to Rich. So with that, let's get started. So the first question here, Rich, they're just starting to come in.
Awesome.
Cool. So first question, do we really need a daily Scrum? It kind of gets boring just answering those 3 questions every day.
It does. If all you're doing is answering the 3 questions every day, that would get really boring. Just kind of like the same thing with the retrospectives that are just, what do we do well? What do we need to improve? And how are we going to change? I think there's one thing, to consider is changing up your formats, right? Just making sure that you keep it fresh and engaging for people, because if you're doing Scrum for a long time on the same effort with the same team, you don't want things to get stale, right? And just trying to answer those 3 standard questions of, what I do yesterday, what do I do today, what impediments are in my way, can get kind of boring, right? So we'll talk a little bit more about what you could do in just a sec, but remember the importance of the daily Scrum. It's sort of just that minimum bit to help enable some transparency for the development team about what they're doing for their work. It's sort of like there to help us replace other meetings and checkpoints, and let's try to gather together. Not at other times. Nothing saying you can't, but if you're really looking to make sure just that we're all on the same page, we've got a good understanding of what's going on with our work and kind of who's working on what. The daily Scrum is your key event for that. If we don't go and have it every day, we're going to lose some of that transparency, and we're really going to lose our ability to inspect and adapt our ability towards meeting the sprint goal. So make sure you have your daily Scrum every day. Maybe, none of the weekends when no one's there, but or if you are working, go ahead and do that. But you still try to keep that point where you're just having a conversation about how are we going to collaborate today? How are we going to make progress towards our sprint goal? And how can we optimize ourselves to do that? So just some quick tips. Maybe just throw up the sprint goal in your daily Scrum and take a look at that and say, hey, does everyone know how we're getting there today? How are we collaborating today, right? Or maybe just put up your product backlog items that you're working on in the current sprint backlog and say, are these things done yet? What are we going to do today to get them there? And so those can be other ways that you might organize your daily Scrum just to make it a little bit more fresh and not so boring as you go through and still find those ways to inspect and adapt.
Great, thanks, Rich. And just always remember why it's called Scrum. It's about how do we move the project or the product forward, just like how a scrum in rugby moves the ball forward. Right? And that daily Scrum is all about looking at, are we heading toward our sprint goal, the goal, as in rugby, the end line, and what do we need to do to make sure we're heading toward that goal? It's not about the status, but it really is about getting forward and inspecting what we're doing and moving forward. So thanks.
Yeah. And as a team, right? Not just as one person, because sometimes you might have people are really busy, right? And others don't know if there's any way for them to plug in. And without that opportunity, just to meet at least once a day and go and say, hey, what's going on here? I've got some time, or I finished this work. Does anyone need any help? Or if you see another team member struggling, to be able to come together as a development team and help them out. Can really be good, and that you can use the daily Scrum to help you move together as a team towards that goal.
Exactly. That's great. Thanks, Rich. So the next question, I know you teach our PSK class, so you may be able to answer this. If not, that's cool, and we can take it offline as well. But Debbie's got a question. I have a question it's more about Kanban really than Scrum, but I think it can apply in either way. So we'll give it a shot. We have some repetitive tasks that we do every week, and each one may only take a few minutes to complete. It would add more overhead to edit a Kanban ticket, as she says in this case, but I can see it, anything on the backlog as a backlog item for each one. So I'm opening a weekly ticket for this task, and each time I do one, I book it to the weekly ticket. Is doing this a way for some tasks a big no-no, or is it okay to do some of these things?
Well, thanks, Debbie. I'm kind of curious as well. Maybe I can ask another question while I'm trying to think this through. Is the work that repetitive weekly task type work something that goes towards the product itself, right? Is that work towards the sprint goal that we're talking about, or is it something kind of just work that you do as part of your job, kind of day to day? That would be interesting to know, because maybe it belongs, on a Kanban board for the work that the entire development team's doing, and maybe just it belongs on a board to help make it visible to you. Do we have a response for that?
I don't yet.
Okay.
Actually, yeah. So we're not doing Scrum. We're talking about
Just Kanban.
yeah.
So
So like Jira admin, someone needs an account established, things like that.
okay. So then just doing, kind of Kanban flow, if you're just mapping out all of your work there as it comes through that flow, some of those things might be, actual columns on a board that you can go and map out. But just making that work visible can be helpful, right? I understand it feels like it's too much overhead to move it along, especially if it goes so quick. But if you're getting a lot of these types of requests, or if these things are coming up, and they impact other work from getting done, showing them on the board can help bring some transparency into why other work takes a little bit longer to accomplish, because there's work that we have to do that's getting repetitive through there. And make sure it doesn't get lost, right? So I do that with our house, for like feeding the dog. It's just every day, who's fed the dog, and kind of move that through and make sure that we're all going and doing that. Because if I'm out training, my wife has to take that over, but when I come back, it's like, well, is she doing it or am I doing that, right? And so just making sure that's there, and it's like, yeah, this feels kind of old, but it ensures that the important things do happen. So I don't see a problem with putting those things on there. What I think is just what's the benefit that you're getting out of that, and what other information might you see by making that work transparent? And if there's value in making that work transparent, but because of what it tells you about other work you're doing or ensures that it happens, I'd say keep it on the board for a while. If not, and you can track that work in some other way, maybe it's just a calendar notification that you need to have or something like that, so that because it's not important towards the rest of the work that's getting done, maybe you track it in some other way.
Great. Thanks, Rich. And I think you hit on Debbie's question.
Awesome.
So the next question, how can a Scrum Master who's working with several teams manage different locations? Say they're in a different building, for example. How do they spread themselves across those teams? Any suggestions?
That's a tricky one. I think that that Scrum Master probably knows the best, because of their location, right? If they can literally just walk over to another building, great, good for them. We should remember at least that a Scrum Master doesn't have to be, like hovering over their development team or their product owner all the time. They're always trying to go and find out what's impeding our ability to use Scrum successfully there, and what can I go and get myself into that really helps us ramp up the value that we get from using Scrum. So sometimes that's working with, a certain development team, and just kind of seeing how are they moving through things and bringing back observations to them about, do you realize you're not really communicating all that well, or the three of you that are sitting in this little cube pod over here aren't talking with the people who are across the hall all that well. Like you can actually get up to move and talk to each other. And for those kinds of things, you might need to have a physical presence, just to see it, right? But even if you're not there, it might come up in other kinds of ways, right? If you're going and visiting another team. And so sometimes maybe as well, the Scrum Master isn't even with one of their development teams or their Scrum teams. They might be working with stakeholders to get them to understand a little bit more about the product backlog and kind of how they can work with the product owner on that, or talking with somebody in finance to try to help us go and understand how to better, fund Scrum efforts and products in that kind of way. So, I'd caution on just the fact that, you need to be near all these teams. Even if you're a Scrum Master for one Scrum team, you're still a Scrum Master for the organization, and you might be doing other things in those areas too. So that's some things to consider. Otherwise, yeah, walk around. Maybe, if there's some kind of video type, always on video situation that you can kind of pop in and out of, with people there. That might help. Or just, set some office hours for your teams to say, hey, you know what, I'm just going to pop over to this building between 1:30 and 3 p.m. And so if you have some questions, come on over and work with me while I'm in this physical location, because tomorrow I'm, driving down to our other office 30 minutes away. I'm going to be spending the day over there.
Great. Thanks, Rich.
Mm-hmm.
So here's a pretty common one that certainly comes up a lot, and there's certainly a lot of exercises in our training classes that help address this as well. Because I think, as I read it, you'll understand. But I think it's really getting a new team to understand the value of the events. My team is an existing team, and they're now being told, or in this case, it says asked, but it sounds like told, that they are going to do Scrum. The team is complaining there's too many meetings, daily Scrum, refinement, sprint review, retro, sprint planning, and they're now complaining they don't have enough time to do their actual work. How would you talk to the team through this?
Interesting story about that. I encountered a very similar thing. I had a team that they said felt like all they were doing was they were spending all their time in meetings. And there was a little bit of truth to that, because something that wasn't made apparent to me when I first went and joined to help out with them as a Scrum Master was that they were actually on multiple different efforts, right? So I had a team that was doing internal consulting within their organization, and I thought that they were dedicated towards the product effort that we were working on. So we would be setting up, refinement sessions and having daily scrums and whatnot. And almost as soon as they finished that, they had to go and jump on other products and projects that they were essentially contracted out to. So they did literally spend all their time in there when we thought we were scaling those events to fit the time box that we had. So I don't know if that situation applies here, but just see kind of what else, I think the overall thing is what else might the development team be into? Are there other meetings that they're attending, and do they really need to attend those other meetings? Like, are there other architecture review sessions and things, and are teams being told to go to those? Do they feel they have to, and what value do they get out of that? Because the Scrum meetings are kind of, they're actually sort of minimal, in that they're meant to help you eliminate some of these other meetings. But let's say I have a 2-week Scrum, right? I have a day probably where I'm having reviews, retrospectives, planning, or maybe we split those up between 2 days. But otherwise, I'm asking for 15 minutes of time from a development team during their workday. And if we've got a standard, let's say 8-ish hour workday, that's about 8 hours, right? 7 hours, 45 minutes or so of time that we can just spend working together on building the product. So usually when I hear that kind of question, about or that those complaints that there's so many meetings, I like to look for, well, what else are these people attending, and does it really provide value, and are they getting taken away from doing their work? And once we can figure out what that question is, that can maybe help us adjust the other ones. Otherwise, though, to spend a day every 2 weeks kind of refining and planning stuff out, not usually that bad, especially when you get to connect with the value that it can provide you for setting up, what this work can look like, actually connecting with the people that want to use your products and hearing from them like, wow, that's really cool. Thanks for building that. It's just kind of motivating. And I can find those meetings sometimes good to go to, which teams maybe don't attend right now or don't get to see their customers right now. And the retrospective can also be, a good one to just figure out like, yeah, how are we going to really ramp this up and get a little bit better? So I hope that helps out a little bit more from the whole meeting time kind of thing. Just go out there and see, is there anything else that these Scrum teams are getting into, whether forced or otherwise, that maybe they should pull back from a little bit and focus on product delivery.
Thanks, Rich. And I think some of it always comes down to, are they seeing the value in why we're having these meetings? They're not meetings for meeting's sake.
Yeah.
They're really focused on, are we moving toward our sprint goal, learning the whole empirical process of Scrum. We're not doing a sprint review just to show people what we did. We're doing it to get the feedback and making sure that we're actually building the right thing and heading in the right directions. We're planning, because otherwise, how do we know what to work on? We're retrospecting to make sure we're working together in the same way. And I know you guys run exercises in some of our classes to kind of prove some of that out too.
Yeah, I remember running into a previous student while visiting a client, my client site one time, and I was asking him, "How you doing?" And he's like, "I'm awesome." I'm like, "Awesome. Okay, well, that's good. What's making things so awesome right now?" And he said, he used to be in just doing system architecture, and it's like in Waterfall, I would work for weeks or months in all these different meetings and trying to gather all this information, and I'd hand stuff off, and I wouldn't hear about it again for sometimes months or years. And sometimes things would get canceled, and that was just kind of demotivating. He never felt connected to his work. So coming to the sprint review, right, when they started doing Scrum, he said, now I'm seeing my stakeholders, every week or every, like, I think they were every week at that point. And they're getting to use these things that we're building, and it's really neat to see like the purpose in my work. And then in the daily Scrum, he's like, I'm collaborating with the people on like, hey, well, we've got this architectural issue. I can come over here and pair with you, and we can start talking through what it should look like, and then create the solution right there on the fly. So that was also connecting him with his work a little more, because it wasn't just creating diagrams, and trying to lay things out theoretically. He was seeing this stuff come alive. So each event was providing more purpose for him too.
Great. Thanks, Rich.
Mm-hmm.
So this could be a fun one. What are some of your favorite retrospective formats to help freshen things up?
Favorite retrospective formats. The sailboat is fun, but I see it get overplayed a little bit. So that's always kind of a little weird. I've been trying to get a little bit more into liberating structures over the past year and learning about them a bit more. And so I sometimes try to combine a few of those to create a new retrospective. So one thing that I did with the team recently was we did this thing called impromptu networking, where people get together in pairs with some kind of prompt, like maybe I'll say something about what was one thing that surprised you about, like what was one thing that surprised you about this past sprint? Get together in pairs and tell a story to the to each other about that that surprise. We go through that a few rounds, and then all of a sudden people start to see patterns and everything that start to emerge. And so maybe we'll capture those out, talk a little bit about that, kind of debrief, and then I combine that with 2510 crowdsourcing to go and have everyone start thinking about, all right, well, what's one thing we could do next sprint to make the sprint even better? And then you start exchanging cards and handing off to people, and everyone starts to vote their idea from 1 to 5 on the card on how good they think this is, and suddenly you get this ranked order of ideas. And it's like, well, why don't we go and take these to action, right? Take the top one or maybe the top 2 or 3 to action. So that could be a fun way to kind of mix it up, because it gets people up and moving around rather than just sitting in one place, so energy stays a little bit higher. I see Eric also listed tasty cupcakes, lots of good ideas on there. There's just a lot of different retrospective techniques. And then Esther Derby and Diana Larson, the Actual Retrospectives book, has a whole bunch of patterns in there, which are really neat. But I think that the best one is the meta pattern in the beginning, where they talk about like coming in, getting some data out there, right? Just gathering information from the group, letting the group respond to that in a kind of an emotional way, a gut feel, figuring out now what do we want to do with that, right? Kind of what insights do we get out of that? And then what actions are we going to take from those insights? So that's sort of this meta pattern that you can use to start coming up with all kinds of techniques. And if things get really boring, I'd also say just change the location. Go to a park, go hang out in the lobby, go to a restaurant, go do your retrospective, over lunch or something. Still have the retrospective, but sometimes just changing up the location can infuse a little bit more energy into it and get conversation flowing a little better.
Great, thanks, Rich. And yeah, I threw up there's a great site for lots of activities and games and different things called tastycupcakes.org. I threw that in the chat there, that you can certainly check out and get lots of resources that you can use.
Yeah.
So next question, this is a pretty common one. How do you advise management when their Scrum teams just continue to grow, and now they're over 17 members? So rather than creating multiple teams, they're just, let's add more people to the Scrum team.
Wow. Okay. So another interesting question is, who's adding these people to the team? I guess management in this case, and it's sort of like why. It's a good question to ask. Of, do we just have people we need to put on a team because we didn't know where else to put them, or is our Scrum team actually asking for additional help in certain areas because they're maybe missing a skill that either they could maybe pick up themselves, but are getting by having additional people with that skill being brought on. I'm going to draw something out here really quick, if this maybe also can help us out. So we've got large team, right? If I just kind of start drawing a team, I can start adding people. I start with my team of 5, my development team here, and then we add a few more people, and we add a few more people, and we add a few more people, right? And we just have this big group of people that, how are they going to have all these conversations, right? If I think about how conversations flow between one person and another, like all these different lines of communication that start coming in just get really messy and hard to go and add any kind of cohesiveness. Usually when I see things like that, what ends up happening with the teams is that they start naturally fragmenting themselves, right? So all of a sudden these 5 people over here will get together and they'll start doing some work in one area, and then we'll have another group of people over here, and they'll be doing some other work. And if you start to see that to happen, right, where the team starts naturally splitting themselves up into different teams, I'd suggest just let it happen, right? Create new development teams that are focused in different kinds of areas. And that's sometimes hard for management to accept, right? Because they want to maybe have control over who these teams are and understand where things are. But if that's the way that the people that are doing the work feel that they should organize themselves to best accomplish the work, right? And what does management really care about? They care about getting this work done, right? Actually having a product, not just trying to go and kind of control your life. But they think they can do that to make it better. But if this starts to happen, just let it happen, right? Let's create 2 or 3 multiple teams out of that, if that makes sense. Maybe you start creating some kind of community of practice between them where, there's a few people over here, like this, purple-headed person and this purple-headed person here, right? Which actually have some kind of common knowledge, right? Maybe they're both UX type people or something. And so at that point, okay, cool. We'll have some kind of user experience group, which we can get back together and kind of help, cross collaborate and share ideas. But they should still maybe be on their own separate teams. The other thing that I consider for that is sort of when you have this big team, right? And so like if I've got a product owner over here, right, and I've got my development team all over here, right, and I've got a whole bunch of people, and together they're one big Scrum team, right, as one big container kind of around them. That's the container that we want in Scrum, right? We want the Scrum team to really go and thrive, and I'll throw a Scrum Master in here too. Okay? But I might have a manager over here who is responsible for these people, and I might have another manager over here who is responsible for these people, and then this person kind of right here might actually be the manager for this group right here, right? If I were to kind of do that. So, and so when you start looking at mapping this out, this is like, you can look at the the containers that people are part of, and what differences might exist. I start to see these walls start to get reinforced here because of management, taking over certain areas, and then teams not really being supportive of the Scrum team, right? The thing that we want to optimize for is, this Scrum team here. And I think it's important, especially Scrum Masters, to come back and start highlighting that with management to say, hey, this team needs to be able to accomplish work. And if they feel like they have a better way of doing it, such as, creating these other separate teams, then by all means, please let them do that, because that helps us build products better. And so this might be a good opportunity for a Scrum Master to kind of understand a little bit more about the development team, what's going on here for them. Why are these people coming in? Are they asking for that kind of help, or are there other ways? Or if management is just kind of keep assigning people to a team because let's find out why, and do they understand the impact that this could be having, and then maybe ask them, like, could we approach the team and say, hey, how are you all doing right now? If we add another person, what do you think that would do? Is there some other way that we can manage this? Because we've got a great person here that needs to get involved, but we don't know where to put them right now. So these are just maybe some ideas that can help you from understanding like the growth of teams. Now, that said, a team of 17 may actually function well. The biggest development team that I ever saw was about 20 people. And there were actually 2 teams that merged together when they were doing some very correlated work. And they had to be very diligent on their communication. They were very, very effective because they'd already been working a lot together as 2 different teams. But they realized that the best thing that they could do for one sprint here, minimally, was to come together as a single team. After that, they actually separated into 4 new teams when they broke back up. So I tried to push this decision down to the development team to figure out how do they want to organize into different teams, with the goal of how does that actually help us go work better together to build a better product.
Great, thanks, Rich. So Maria's got a question about the product owner. What can a product owner do if the development team members are requiring very detailed, described little small tasks? They don't want to break user stories into smaller tasks themselves. They want the product owner to do all of that.
Saying that, if I recall again, the development team doesn't want to break down the work into smaller tasks?
Correct. They want the product owner to provide very, very detailed descriptions of all tasks.
Okay. Um, and perhaps a flippant answer that might even come straight from Scrum though is, as a product owner, push back and say, actually, it's not my responsibility to tell you how you do your work, right? I'm here to help maximize the value of the product, and I'm trying to understand what our customers want, describe that, describe the value that's coming out of that, describe what we want this product to kind of be when it's done. But I'm not the expert in how to actually go and build this stuff. You are, right? So if you don't want to break down the work, don't break down the work. But if you want it broken down, that's kind of more on you, right? So maybe that pushback can help a little bit there with explaining kind of the accountabilities of each of the roles there. And maybe by simply, refusing to do it, saying, hey, if there's something you don't understand about the product backlog item in terms of what it is that we're looking for here and why we want to do it, I'd be happy to answer that question. But as a product owner, I'm not getting involved in how, and just leave that be, and see what your development team does with it. Maybe they continue to get the product done as well as they can. Maybe they start splitting stuff up, on their own because they need it anyway. But that's really their responsibility. So I'd push off and then retrospect with that, especially with the help of a Scrum Master to kind of guide the development team through, maybe by looking at a historical, version of their sprint backlog. How did work flow through? Did we see stuff get stuck? Why did it get stuck, right? If it was getting stuck, maybe we need to break it down more. Why did you break it down when you're doing it? What did you do every day, right? And just could you have broken it down into daily tasks, daily work that you'd want to do? Or one of my favorite ways of actually managing a sprint backlog is, I write up a bunch of acceptance tests right off the bat, right, in sprint planning of, oh, I've got all these acceptance criteria. How would I test that, right? And so I start with a bunch of failing tests, and the sprint backlog, the plan is get these tests to pass, because that helps us meet acceptance criteria, and new tests will come up along the way. But if you're struggling to just break down work, maybe you bring it down to, well, how will I know that this is done, and measure progress against that.
Great, thanks, Rich.
Yeah.
So here's an interesting one. So my organization is low on the agile maturity scale. We started to use Scrum about a year ago, and I'm trying to encourage people to break out of silos and become more T-shaped. However, the manager of the development team has told them that they can't test at all because it goes against ITIL. I don't think this is valid. Any input, any ideas, anything that can help Megan talk to the team in that manager?
Wow. Okay. So let me try to recount this here. We first talked about T-shaped, which whoops, let me just for those who aren't understanding, right? T-shape is sort of, I've got depth in a certain area, and breadth of skills. So maybe you're deep in testing as a skill, but you can also do a little bit of coding, a little bit of database work, or something like that. And just having more T-shaped people on your team certainly helps you manage risk a little bit more, right? In terms of just going through and ensuring, like, if our testing specialist isn't around, we can still get something done. And so to go a little bit further, I don't know a lot about ITIL, to be honest. So I'm not sure how saying that testers, only testers doing testing, actually helps us comply or go against ITIL. But if at least in Scrum, the development team as a whole is responsible for that testing. Now, that could be everybody doing that work if that helps us get the job done. That could be a single person. It's really up to the development team to kind of figure that one out. I've seen times where one or two people are doing the bulk of that kind of work, but then there's a risk that, do others know what to do there, especially if somebody goes on vacation. That happened to a development team I was on, where our testing specialist went on vacation for a week, and some of us didn't know how to log into some of the test servers that we were using that he created. So how do we manage that? So I think the kind of the key thing there is to figure out what's the need for that requirement. For testers being the only people who are doing testing. Is there some kind of regulation that we're trying to meet, or something else that says, this is done to ensure a security of a certain level or whatnot, and see, is there another way that we can go and solve that kind of problem? And does the regulation really state that, right? And I wrote a while back about like FAFSA finance reporting for like CapEx and OpEx expenditures. And if you read it, it feels a lot like we have to do waterfall because that's the predominant, framework and methodology that was out when the guides were written. But it doesn't say you have to use waterfall. It says you have to clearly define what's, a feature product versus what's maintenance, and have some way of acknowledging that. That might just be a flag on a product backlog item. So that's maybe a start there. What am I missing in that question? I feel like there's something that I'm missing towards the beginning of that question that wasn't answered.
No, I think you hit it, Rich. I think the big thing is this manager's possibly, to me, using it to prevent their development team from doing testing, and they're using potentially either misunderstandings that they may have of ITIL, or just trying to use process as a weapon.
Yeah.
So to my understanding, and it's been a while since I've worked with ITIL, it defines what you need to do, not who. There's no who in ITIL and who needs to do what. So there's nothing, to my knowledge and understanding, or certainly my recollection, that says, well, developers must write code and testers must test code. It talks about the process of configuration management and delivery, and in those different pieces, and these things must be done, and a lot of the checks and things like that, but not who. So I would get them to describe back to you. Okay, where does it say? Bring it up.
Yeah.
Development manager, show me where it says that our developers can't do testing, because every best practice in the world, or every practice, there's no such thing as a best practice. Every practice that we see, and certainly evidence, is working together to understand quality is critically important, and improves for more successful software delivery. So
Yeah.
I would bring it back to them.
I had that something similar happen with a credit union that I worked with. They had to leverage a third party to do testing, in order to meet some kind of regulation funding requirement. It was just that they wanted to have some kind of separation of concerns in there, and so they said, who created the product couldn't have the final say on the testing of it. And it was like, okay. And so the Scrum team got together and like, this just doesn't feel weird. I'm like, do you really have to do that? And they showed me the contract and the requirements that said like, yes, we have to go use this other third party. I'm like, okay. And the Scrum team said, well, what should we do? And I was like, well, maybe you can make them as bored as possible, right? Like if you're handing off something and saying that this is releasable, right? This is done, and you think that it needs a certain level of testing to get there to ensure you've done what you said you were doing to help you design the products that you're actually building, then do that testing, right? And you ideally want to be handing off products to this other testing group that are better and better and better in quality, such that they literally have nothing to report other than, yeah, everything looks good. And then that shows the value of how good this development team is doing in building that product in the first place. So, if there has to be some kind of other third-party verification, that's fine. But on a Scrum team, yeah, I would take a look at, leveraging the entire team to make sure that we get the work done that we need to. And like Eric and I have been saying, like, come back to, is that really a requirement? Like, or is it just a misunderstanding about how something's written? And if it is really a requirement, how is that actually helping us to achieve the goal? Or does it not? Might we want to look organizationally in the future about moving towards something different if this is impeding our progress towards achieving our goals?
Great, thanks, Rich. So there's a question here. I'm going to rephrase it a little bit, but Steve asks specifically, what are your thoughts on the practices of Scrumban? To my understanding and reading lots of things around it, many people call many different things Scrumban. So I'm going to rephrase it, and Steve, feel free to chime in with more questions. But you're one of our professional Scrum with Kanban trainers. Well, we'll talk about that and why using Scrum with Kanban and the value of it.
So I agree. Using Scrum and Kanban together have been awesome. I've been trying to bring more teams to doing that I work with lately than not. And so that's fine. And I agree, like I often see many different definitions of Scrumban. Sometimes it's we're doing Scrum and Kanban, sometimes it's we're doing Scrum, but we're not because we don't have a retrospective, because we can kind of do that whenever we want, or we don't really need planning because we just pull things through the board, or whatever the definition might need to be there. I think some key things to think of is if you're doing Scrum, do Scrum, right? And the Scrum guide or the Kanban guide for Scrum teams also calls that out. It says, if you're doing Scrum, Scrum's kind of at the forefront there. We still need to have a product owner, a development team, a Scrum Master. We still need to have a sprint, and the container of a sprint planning, daily scrums, sprint retrospectives, sprint reviews. We still need to have an increment at the end of every sprint. We still need to have a product backlog and a sprint backlog. But then we can use Kanban to have a much better understanding of flow. And so I think what we can get out of that is actually some really good insights into what's going on with our product. So if I were to just kind of create, sort of a basic Kanban board here, right? Something very, very simple. I might have like, in the middle here, something for building, like build code, build stuff. I might want to verify. And then like measure, like deploy. I'll do one more. I was just gonna say, I'm gonna add measure. Right over here. I might have a ready queue. And I could also, let's just say, here's analyze. And to do. So why I kind of drew it out this way is to sort of show a couple of different things here. I can have one item in here, right? And we take one item, and the idea is to pull it all the way through the Kanban board as you're going through here, right? And so any item on here where I'm looking at things of value, right? Items of value here, so product backlog items, then I'm going to build into the product and get it out there. But when I look at this at a Kanban board here, what I often kind of like to do is say, where does it really all point to? And so this part right here might represent our product backlog. So this is stuff that we still have to do. That maybe there's just a whole bunch of stuff that we don't even know what it is yet that's in that column. The analyze might be things that are getting refined at the time, right? That we're going through, refining these product backlog items, breaking them down a little bit further, adding some detail, kind of getting them to a point where they are ready, right? And so things that are ready and getting built here, maybe, and even into verify, these could be things that are in our sprint backlog. Okay, and then towards the end, when we actually get stuff out, right, even in the verify, deploy, measure, this is part of the increment. And so when I look at it this way, because I draw it this way because it's not so much about time when you're looking at moving things through. Kanban helps make work really transparent, right? It's there to help enable hyper transparency into our work and help us understand the flow of work, right? And when I think about that, it comes back to the things that help give us transparency in Scrum are artifacts, the product backlog, sprint backlog, and the increment. So those a given item of value that we want to make transparent might be in different places in different states at different times. So we can look about pulling these things through and representing that flow here. And so this kind of also could help us say that, as we're moving along, this item, in the product backlog, it might be there for a little while. We get it into the sprint backlog. We want to start watching it move through there really quickly. And we might want to measure the cycle time there to say, like, are we getting these things done within a sprint, or kind of how many things, because that can help us plan in the future of how much work to pull into the next sprint, as well as when might we expect that to be done and future forecasting against the product backlog. And then even once we get something completed, right, done is just releasable. I might still want to measure that thing a little bit further out, especially if I'm applying good UX practices to say, I've got these hypotheses about how this thing will affect our customers, and how are we going to measure that response? So I get something out, I verify that it's working, it's ready to go. And, that might be when we're actually done. I deploy it, right? So it's part of an increment. It's now deployed and in production, and now I'm going to measure that, continuously as we go along. So this is where I think Kanban can really kind of, help from an overall perspective of where your work flows. But I also think, like, even down when I get just to this part here about, ready, build, verify, deploy, if I just look at measuring, cycle time and such, kind of in this area here, and everything that comes through this spot, that can help our Scrum team really understand, like, where's work going right now this sprint. Are we getting things done? How much work can come in? If something's sitting around for a long time, why and what do we want to do about that, right? How can we collaborate as a team to make sure we pull this item, through, rather than kind of letting it get stagnant there on the board? So Kanban together with Scrum can help a whole lot. Now, and that's why we kind of say it in that way, that make sure you're doing Scrum and then add Kanban with that, right? So that we can help get some visualization here and some much better transparency into the flow of work, rather than when we say Scrumban, like you said, there's so many different definitions. It's kind of hard to see what we make. It's better to kind of get it out there with everybody. So does that help?
Yeah, Steve kind of added to this, and I think it was in line with what you just said. He says, if we're only doing parts of Scrum, should we just call it Kanban and not confuse things? He said, the principles of Kanban, and just start there. Wouldn't it just be best to call it Kanban? And I think what you've now said, and I think addresses this, which is, don't change Scrum, continue to use Scrum. It's a simple framework that you're pulling practices from Kanban into to work in a manner that improves how you're working. But yeah, if you're not using all of Scrum, those 16 pages, then don't call it Scrum.
Right. And it might work for you, and that's great, right? There's a lot of people that are very successful just doing Kanban. Occasionally, people have success doing waterfall. Not all that often, and there's a lot of cycle time, a lot of change, right? That as we go through in life, I think our organizations, our products, our customers' needs, et cetera, keep changing at an ever increasing pace. So Scrum can help us deal with that change, right? At least by having these continuous feedback loops, right? And inspect and adapt at different times. And then Kanban just helps bring some transparency to that work. And so maybe in a sprint review, we're looking at this and we can see what items are verified and ready to deploy. We can talk with stakeholders about that, right? Just by pulling up, go through their increments, see if they like it, and then show them the board and say, yeah, here's what's good. Here are the things that are still in measurement, right? That we're still analyzing. And again, all of that is done in the scope of a sprint, right? The sprint is just a time box to help us kind of go and check back in on things on a regular cadence there. So even if you're doing Kanban here, that can help. But if you're not doing Scrum, like, you start taking these things out, again, you're just not doing Scrum. You might get some value out of it, but all the things that are still in Scrum can have some value in very specific ways. And when you start looking at how to combine these two, and we do talk about that a lot in the PSK class, you start finding new ways to go and bring that and say, hey, maybe we should be doing Scrum all the time, even though we're already doing Kanban, because we can get some additional value out of those different events. And the conversations that they go and promote.
Great, thanks, Rich.
Yeah.
So the next question is about measurement and actually about planning and estimating.
Okay.
So it asks about, we've got different people on our Scrum team. We've got a UI developer, a server-side person, a database person, and so on. So does it make sense to estimate when all these people are touching different parts of the system and none of them, they're not so cross-functional, I guess is probably the best way to put it. And my initial thought when I read this was, well, no, most features are touching all of those different pieces. Most user stories are touching those pieces. So although different people may be coding different parts, they come together to define and work on stories.
Yeah.
So your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So I think the cool thing to highlight here is that we still have, it still sounds like this is a very cross-functional team, right? We might have a bunch of specialists that are only doing one type of work, and they'll figure out in time how that works for them or doesn't work for them. But I still think that everyone should be kind of estimating in something here, because sometimes you get somebody who comes in and they don't know anything about the work. It's like I have, let's say my database specialist is coming in here, and the majority of our changes are UI based, right? And they don't really know much about it because they're not working in that area. I still ask teams in those areas to, or people to estimate with some kind of, answer, like, I don't know, maybe this is extra large, or this is, like a 21, or whatever units you're using to estimate. Mostly because that can help spawn conversation, right? The key thing on all these different estimation techniques, like using planning poker or wall estimation or anything like that, they're just ways for the team to analyze the work and have better conversations so that way they can make decisions about that work, including splitting it up, or capturing other areas that we need to test, or even deciding what's not in there. So somebody even saying, I said it's extra large because I don't know, when everyone else said it was a small or a medium, can at least start spawning those conversations like, well, I don't know, but well, what don't you know about it? What, can we explain it a little bit more? If your development team is willing to do that, that's great. Right now, share some of that knowledge back out. And sometimes just the very act of others on the team who would be more involved in the work talking through it might help them understand a little bit more about it and say, oh, actually, I missed something here. We should capture some additional detail because we also have to check when we integrate with this other service over here. There's maybe some additional tests to write for that. And so even though it's not a certain skill that got brought in, again, all we're talking about here is analysis, and helping us plan our work out better. The estimate itself is like the smallest part of that equation, the least important part of that whole conversation.
Great, thanks, Rich.
Yeah.
Looks like we have time for at least one or two more. We've got one here that actually I've heard come up quite a bit and had conversations about. So let's go to this one. Our company is I can't speak. Our company is highly regulated, and so releases only happen about 4 times a year. How can we improve our Scrum practice under these limited release conditions? Sometimes work will sit in a branch for many months prior to the actual release.
Okay. So this one's kind of interesting. Remember, within Scrum, we're creating a potentially releasable increment at the end of every sprint. Just because something is releasable doesn't mean we have to actually go and release it. So the fact that we're still releasing every quarter because that's what makes the most sense, or just that's what we've been doing, is still fine, right? We might find a way to push up that release cycle, and I think that would be a good thing to look into. But even if we're deciding to release every quarter, every single sprint, the team should still have something ready to be released. So, let's say you're currently sprinting every month, right? So at least 3 times in that release period, we should have something new and ready to release, ready to fall back on. And so let's say if one of those sprints, we have a big problem and something causes an issue and we can't go and get those changes in, we can at least go back to what we had the sprint before and release that code. And it sounds like already using source control here. So getting back to that earlier state shouldn't be that challenging, right? Maybe those environment changes you have to be aware of, but we can at least use source control to help us guarantee that releasable state of our product and our code. Go back to that and release from that. If you're sprinting more frequently than that, and then you have just more potentially releasable increments, right? And so all this then can help us get to the best possible release date when we get to that actual release date, right? So if we're working with our stakeholders every month, or let's say every week, right? If we've got a sprint every week, we're bringing in stakeholders, we're making sure that our products are meeting their needs while still meeting these regulatory requirements. and that they're gaining confidence that when we go to market, we're actually going to meet this regulation, right? We're going to be done. Maybe we already met the regulation by sprint 2 out of 3 sprints in that quarter. So they can go and have some confidence. They can already, be ready to work with the market. They could be ready to work with people in the government or other regulators who are going to be checking in with this. Maybe pull them in earlier to show them the product and say, hey, let's get this tested now because we want to get this out and make sure that everything is good to go. So the sooner you can meet the regulations, the better, right? And having that constant cadence of a sprint and having a releasable increment can keep us on track to ensuring that we are in a releasable state and that we're doing things like, cool, this is done, this is good, we can merge it into trunk, right? Rather than keeping that branch open for a really long time. And I worked with a bank once where that actually became a strategy for them, where they had regulations and requirements getting out and pushed on them all the time. But they were becoming, because they were using Scrum, they were becoming one of the first banks in their region to meet these regulations, and they could go to market saying, hey, we're one of the first banks that can go and protect your data, and your finances better than any of the other banks, because we're the first ones that meet this updated regulation. So come bank with us, right? And that turned into a value add for them by being able to use Scrum and get these things done earlier.
Great. Well, thanks, Rich. I do want to be conscious of our time box. Excuse me. So I want to thank you for this. If we can move forward to the next slide. And actually, someone has a question, so I'll let you do a little ad too. Someone wanted to know what drawing tool you're using.
Which what? What drawing
What
tool?
drawing tool? Yeah.
So this is Concepts. Concepts is available for Android, iOS, and Windows. In fact, if you look at some of like the new Windows Surface demos, like on their big screen, they're using Concepts. But it was just a really cool drawing app. I loved the little panel right over there, and it's one of the best ones that doesn't move around while I'm drawing on it. So I've got a pixel slate that I'm drawing on over here, so running Android version of the app, and then casting that over to my screen.
Cool. Thanks, Rich. So
Yeah.
thank you, everybody, for your time today. Continue your learning. Make sure you check out the Scrum.org learning paths to keep on going. These are completely free and different paths for different roles: Scrum Masters, product owners, development team members, as well as the Agile leaders. Lots of resources, webinars, blogs, videos, and other things to help you continue your learning as you continue to grow. Next slide. So with that, I just want to say thank you very much. Continue to follow along. Join the forums. Lots of people asking and answering your questions. Follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and continue to read our blog. There's probably about 30 or so blog articles put out every month by our professional Scrum trainers like Rich. With that, again, thank you all very much and have a great day.
Thanks for your questions, everybody.